So, welcome to the podcast of the rise of women's football. Flo Lloyd-Hughes, journalist, pundit, analyst, businesswoman.
Wow.
She does it all.
What a CV. Thank you so much, Alex. Great to be here. And I would say probably I can capture all those different elements, which I'm sure we've already had a lot of people on the show who maybe do that as well. And I think a lot of people who are in the women's football space are quite used to juggling a million different things or having expertise across different elements. So yeah, I do try and do as much as I can.
I think the hardest bit is what do you do for, like, what is your job? And you try to sum it up in probably
do you want
like
me
2
to have,
words.
Do you want me to try and have
What
a go?
What do you usually say when people say, what is your job?
When people, well, if someone asked me, can you email me a bio, I would probably say journalist, broadcaster, and consultant. And consultant is kind of a vague word that everyone claims to be a consultant, but it's
Nobody really knows what a consultant does.
Yes, and I sometimes jump on different projects, and I think that's why it's easier sometimes to say, oh, I kind of do a little bit of comms, do a little PR, but primarily what I do is a lot of broadcast, talking about women's football, and then writing about women's football. So I have a podcast called Counterpressed with Spotify, which is also on Spotify video, and that's a women's football podcast. And we talk about what's happened in the world of women's football in terms of analysing games.
There's always something.
There's always something. I mean, non-stop news. So we talk a lot about what's happening on the pitch, but we also like to talk about the wider women's football culture. So sometimes we dive into books, films, TV shows, talk about kind of fan culture, inclusivity in the game, wider business issues in the game. We try and broaden it out because we know as well that our audience are really interested in those things. So it's quite nice. We have a Monday show, which is let's get into all the games, and there's always a lot to talk about. And then a Thursday show, which is a bit more, maybe sometimes we can have a little fun. Maybe we're talking about Champions League midweek. Maybe we're previewing a big game. And it's really editorially creative, which I think is what I enjoy so much. And I have an amazing team that either appear on the show or help me make the show, or, working with Spotify and everything like that. And then I've also just set up a women's football media platform, much like that. I'm trying. It's not, I'm not a sales guy, but I'm trying my best. I just set up a women's football media platform, much like, Rise of Women's Football. Less business stuff, but it's all about in-depth women's football coverage. So, I've freelanced at a lot of places, BBC Radio, TalkSport, The Athletic, written some stuff for The Guardian, and I think those platforms have been great at driving women's football coverage, especially The Athletic.
They need a bit more.
But they need, I think, a bit more, and I think the reality is women's football and most of women's sport is that if you exist within the editorial framework of men's sport and you are across a sports desk that is already under pressure, under-resourced, as we know all, media publications are. Therefore, women's football and women's sport is never going to get the dedicated coverage it deserves. So I launched the Cutback, which is really about giving fans and, readers of women's football really in-depth coverage. So dedicated writers following the biggest clubs in the WSL, making sure that we're not just doing interviews with the same players telling the same stories. You're saying, okay, Arsenal lost this game. Why did they lose? Yeah. That's what we've got to talk about. Why? What were the decisions that the coach made?
The critical part of women's
what
football.
Was the critical part? Yeah, and I think we're in that next phase now. I mean, I know in your career you've done podcasts that were really focused on the tactics of the women's game, and I think sometimes people haven't kind of been ready for those conversations. But for me, in this next era of women's football that we're certainly in now, we've got to take that type of coverage forward. The game has grown thanks to, a bit more generalistic coverage that focuses on individual players and individual stars, and that's really important and it shouldn't go away. But we've also got to offer fans something else, and that something else has to be what the men's game gets. Because if you watch Super Sunday on Sky Sports, and I think Sky's coverage of the WSL is brilliant, you're going to get a touch screen, you're going to get analysis and everything like that, and Sky do that. But when you look at what Match of the Day is compared to other women's football highlight shows, it's completely different. So fans need to be offered that in-depth coverage. And I think it's funny having chatted to people before I was launching it who were like, I just don't know if there's the audience. I don't know if people are interested. But it's been amazing to see how much people want. They want more.
Yeah.
And it's hard to keep up with that because I've launched it just funding it myself.
Yeah.
But I think what's great is that Counterpress and the Cutback sort of blend quite nicely together. The podcast, which is audio and visual, it has the same sort of approach, and the Cutback is an in-depth written way to sort of bring it to life at the same time.
It kind of complements each other.
Massively,
It's definitely the women's football audience, I think, especially in this podcast, the way that we've spoken about it. A lot of people have been involved in the game for a very long time. You as well. You've been there kind of from the beginning, I guess you could say. We did an interview with Kelly Simmons. It's crazy that she just came into the FA to focus on the WSL in 2018. That's less than 10 years ago. When you look at the timeline and what the growth has been and what the importance has been, it's been a short amount of time. And even for us, like we've, compared to, Kelly Simmons or Joe Tang or, all these people that have been around for literally a long time, our careers have also been kind of the rise of women's football, essentially, because we've seen it. It's been a short amount of time. And for us, we've kind of grown with that as well. So for you, do you remember your first women's football match as a journalist?
As a journalist,
I
that
remember
is
mine
a
because I had
good
such a weird experience.
question, because I mean, I think you're right in some ways that I have been within women's football for a while, but there are also people who've been.
I think
there a lot.
You've been in the very key
in some interesting years,
Yeah.
and probably come in when it's risen the most. Because I think about people like Jen O'Neill or Tony Layton who've been really early adopters, or like Kieran Tavan, people like that, who were covering it in
From
the
the
early
start.
2010s onwards, and even earlier in the case of someone like Jen O'Neill. So. That would have, I sort of really started probably focusing on it the most when I got into my first job out of uni, when I was actually working on sports business trade news. So I wrote about media rights, I wrote about the commercial side of sport, I wrote about sponsorships, I wrote about World Cup and Olympic bidding. And I was the only woman in a quite a small male news team who were all a lot older as well. So I would always, and I wasn't annoyed about this. I wanted the opportunity. I was given a lot of women's sports stories and a lot of women's football stories. And it was just after the 2015 Women's World Cup. So obviously England finished third, first ever major medal.
Yeah.
And there was a big buzz around that. And I think therefore people were starting to care a little bit more about women's football stories and where that was going.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 2017 Euros, they get to a semi-final again. Then we've got, Phil Neville, obviously a famous last name that I think elevates women's football again in the kind of the wider framework of football media in this country. And then I think it sort of goes from there. So I came into covering the women's game, having played women's and grassroots football, having been a huge football fan and having been working in the men's game, and then kind of expanded from there. But realistically, up until England won the Euros, about 70% of my paid work was in the men's game because there just wasn't as much opportunity.
Obviously.
And then probably in the lead up to the Euros, it started to swing maybe like 60-40.
Yeah.
And now it's completely the other way. About probably 70% of my work is women's, and I do less men's. I still do Premier League, EFL
It's more
stuff.
feasible now.
Yeah, exactly. There's more opportunity, there's more investment in the game. So I think that is the biggest sort of sign for me of how much it's changed. In terms of actually remembering the first game I covered, I can't even, from a professional point of view, I can't even remember.
I think I had such a bad experience.
Oh no, what happened?
Well, it was a Chelsea Arsenal in 2019.
Okay.
At Kings Meadow.
After World Cup or before World Cup?
After. So Kings Meadow, Arsenal lost.
Right.
Fine. It was kind of the press, the press huddle after, and Joe Montemurro, the Arsenal manager.
And also, that's pre-COVID, so we used to just be on the pitch.
Yeah, exactly.
With
It was literally, for those who don't know, it was literally the manager would stand and all the journalists would just be in a circle.
It would be
around
a proper scrum.
So that was my first game as a journalist.
Yeah.
And then everyone was quiet because Joe has a character when he loses.
Not
in a bad way, but So I was like, I got this. The newbie here, I'm going to ask the first question.
Wow, that's bold.
One worded answer back.
Yeah.
And I was like, right, I'm going to go home and cry now. No, but that was that. I remember that so clearly.
I mean, that working in football journalism is not for the faint-hearted, and that's not to put anyone off.
No.
But you got to have a thick skin. I mean, in the men's and women's game, I've had plenty of managers who have been very short and pissed off in plenty of interviews, and I found it really tough because I did a lot of radio in my first few years working in football media, and I found that really tough because it's much more exposing than being in a press conference with 30 other journalists. It's normally just you and one other person, maybe probably one and maybe another, but normally it's like two of you, and you're just standing next to the manager with your phone asking them some questions, and you're
right in their face,
a feet away, and it's intense. And that stuff you've got to sort of be brave, be bold, and there is always a bit of a hierarchy as well on most experienced guys who might have an existing relationship with that coach, or they've been they're very good at what they do because they've been there around. So it's also it's a bit of a social experiment because you've got to work out like, where's my place here, where do I fit in all this. But I genuinely can't remember what game I would have done. I spent a lot of time at Kings Meadow because I've been there for BBC Radio London when I first started doing radio. Even doing AFC Wimbledon games there before they moved to Plough Lane. Chelsea women there, doing like talk sport as well there. A lot of time at Meadow Park. And what I do miss about doing less men's radio is I love going to football grounds. Yeah. And I used to do a lot more Saturday around the grounds radio, but it is hard work, and it's not very well paid.
No.
But it does take you to some really fun places.
It's a lot of dedicated time.
Yeah, but it's nice. You get to see like where football really exists in England, and English football culture is so unique. So being able to go to all these grounds that I probably wouldn't have gone to unless I was covering a game there,
of course.
Meeting the fans, like, chatting to different managers. I think that I really enjoyed that, and I do really miss that.
Yeah.
But it's been really exciting to be part of the women's game as it's grown and kind of see the interest and the coverage just change drastically.
It's definitely interesting to see kind of, I think us, because I think, you started in England a lot sooner than I did, but I kind of came in and we were all kind of at the same level of, right, so what's going to happen next? What's our role in this progression of everything? And I think it's quite interesting to see us kind of mature with the women's game as well, knowing and kind of accepting that we're ambitious enough to be able to take in more of a leadership role. You're obviously, you with the podcast, with the Cutback. You said it now, you've sacrificed going to a lot of football matches as you did before. Now it's kind of, a different shift, a different focus. You're more interested in kind of, right, what is my role now? What can I do now to, use that opportunity to put in things in women's football that don't exist yet, but need to be done. That shift in kind of mentality, I think, is quite interesting for us. What have you kind of reflected back and thought of, wow, like, I'm at this point now in women's football and in my career that it's shifted so much, but I'm really, really happy where this is going right now?
Yes, and no, because I think, unfortunately, we still exist in quite a fragile economy, especially in media terms. And I think as a freelancer, you never switch off. You never get safe and secure. Yeah, because you just don't know what's around the corner. And I've had lots of jobs that have fallen through, lots of jobs that have been great, but, the production company changes, so therefore you're not working on the show anymore because someone else is making it and you don't have those contacts, etc.
Changes.
Or someone just leaves a company and they're your main in who you had the relationship with. So unfortunately you can never be comfortable ever, because if you're a freelancer that exists, and this is any industry, not just football, but if you work in like fashion or music or film and TV, and given the pressure on those industries, especially in the UK, and how tough it is to be a freelancer in the UK, you just have to kind of just got to ride the roller coaster. I mean, I'm really lucky, really, really lucky to be in a place with Spotify where they back the show, and that's one of my main jobs with them, which I'm really lucky to have that support. But then you're sort of balancing all these other, juggling, and you are beholden to budgets, and you kind of have to figure
and
out
people caring to invest. In
yeah,
women's football at the end of
exactly,
the day.
and seeing the realities of the world impacting those budgets, and then finding out where you sit in those budget impacting. So, yeah, I can never be like, oh, isn't this great?
Yeah.
And I've made it, because also I know how tough broadcast industry is, and if you think about the wider landscape of just sports media in this country, like there aren't a whole lot of women on television talking about football, and it's even harder to age in this industry, especially as a woman, and stay around. So you got to factor those things. Not to be a Debbie Downer, but
it's the reality.
It's the reality, and those are the
everything.
things. And I think the media industry will keep changing, because 10 years ago there were even fewer women doing what we do in the men's and women's game. So it'll keep organically evolving, but it's also just the reality of it's really hard to stick around. And I'm only in my early 30s, so there's a hell of another 30 years of working before I'll probably get the opportunity to say, okay, that's enough. Yeah. And I think that's exciting whenever I talk to young people about the pressure of trying to get a good gig or get a first job.
They have so much time.
There's so much time, and I think you don't know what sort of journey your career is going to go on. I could be sitting here in 10 years and doing something completely different, and that doesn't necessarily matter.
A consultant.
Maybe I could be doing, working as an accountant. Who knows? Unlikely, because I'm terrible at maths. But you never know what sort of direction you're going to go in.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, and not to be afraid of that. Yeah. Because it's the natural side of things. With the cutback, and a little bit of counter press too, like I'm having to flex my muscles and actually have a go at things I'm not massively skilled at. Yeah. So commercial stuff, a little bit of sort of like sales and networking in a business capacity. I've always networked in a journalist and media way. This is different, trying to bring commercial partners on board for something, or trying to make events and stuff happen. That brings its own skill set, and that's kind of pushing me in different ways. But I think one of the big things with the cutback and counterpressed is the strength of community. And I think that's massively important in women's football. I've written about it a couple of times, talk about it all the time. But with both counterpress and the cutback, community is at its core. And I think for women's football, community,
it's a key part of
it, and it's also a big business opportunity, because if you can harness the community, I mean, Arsenal and their fan base, biggest example of an amazing, powerful community that they've kind of managed to harness and make work for them. But if you can do that in a media sense, either with your listeners and make that a really important bond, and also do that with your readers and give them more than just feeling like they're consuming content, but making them feel like they're coming on the journey with you. And it's a hard balance. But with both the counterpress cutback, I think, that's what I've always tried to do, because I think it's even more powerful in the women's game than the men's game.
Yeah, there's definitely a big conversation around, because obviously women's football, the players with everything around women's football, that closeness to fans and that closeness to community is probably the most special part of it. The grounds at women's football play, beat the big stadiums, they're really, really close to the pitch. The players take advantage, sign things after the match, familiar faces for the travelling fans, and that closeness to the players and the club is quite important. I think Arsenal have done it really well of kind of stepping away from the one-on-one engagement with fan and player, but still keeping that community close to the club. They're doing it really well with photographers. They're doing it really well with kind of engaging in the community. I think they did a series, what was it, like not a couple of weeks ago, last week, for LGBTQ fans of their journey, if they met in Arsenal matches. I think they're doing it really, really well. So that's one of the key. I think Arsenal have kind of shifted from the traditional aspect of fans being close to players by just showing up to games and having that, those conversations with the players directly. But it's not easy to do. And Arsenal have had that foundation for a very, very long time. But also, it kind of goes away with more money being invested. It goes away with, commercial directions, with marketing directions that, bigger brands with bigger monies probably don't understand the meaning of community within women's football. That balance, from a media perspective or a business perspective as well, how do you think that's going to be able to progress once more money comes in from external partners?
It's one of the biggest questions I think people are really trying to ask themselves. I think I think Arsenal is a good example, like you've said there. I think there's still an unfair expectation from some fans of that access that they believe that they should have for players, and they've got used to. And obviously, for people that have been following a team for a very long time when women's football wasn't the size it is now, you can understand they'd be a bit, cheesed off about why can't I get pictures or get autographs after the game. But I also think there's a reality check of how expectations fans should stop having, because I see messages all the time, which is completely insane, about people complaining on social media that their kid didn't get a picture or their kid didn't get an autograph and things like that, and they waited around for ages. And unfortunately, that's just not the way it works. And I know clubs are trying to figure out how they can make that work with, I think City I don't know if they still do it, but City for a while brought in this thing where they select a small group who can then go and get autographs or pictures or whatever afterwards. Now, I think you can still have relatable role models that boys and girls can look up to and be inspired by without demanding or requiring an autograph and a picture. I think those two are, they don't go hand in hand here, but I think it's about educating the audience a little bit better, changing the norms of it, and I think that will naturally start to happen. And I think also players should be supported in being independent and not having to just do it because fans make them feel bad. I mean, I think Millie Bright put out a statement recently because she had some fans who wanted an autograph, then also criticising her performance. That accessibility. And I think in her statement, there was a word that she used, and now I've forgotten it, but that kind of it was almost like they're treated like objects. There's this entitlement of we should be getting a piece of them. And I think Millie Bright's statement was really strong, where she said we are not just items and objects that people can get a picture with and then discard. And I think players should be empowered to stand up for that and not feel like they have to stay after a game. And, I think they do that because they love the fans and they want to give back. But I think it's unfair pressure on them too. And I think we'll start to see more of that, hopefully organically kind of end, because I just don't think it's realistic, and I think it's tough on the players. But what you need to do in order to make sure you still create the bond with the fan base is make sure you've got the right people working for the club who understand the fans, and that's the biggest thing. And it comes from problem. And that's the thing, and it comes from the commercial side as well. So if you've got sponsors who want to activate and do things, they also need to know what they're doing and understand not just women's football culture, but also the club they're working, because they're not all the same. Arsenal are now this amazing case study, but they are very unique on their men's and women's side. I mean, think about where they're located. It's very centrally London, in between North and East London. It's a great location if you're trying to activate and do cool things in the capital city.
There's a lot of youth. There's a lot of...
Most people don't have that in their advantage. And that'll be the same for the men's and women's team, right? And also they've got Adidas in a kit sponsor who is constantly innovating and delivering merchandise. Sometimes a little bit too much merchandise. But you know what I mean? They are constantly creating and delivering bits and pieces that are exciting, and they're a unique one. But not every club is the same, not every location is the same. Manchester City, big successful men's team, fairly successful women's team, always had big stars through the door, but it's taken them a while to build up regular good numbers at the CFA, and they've got there now with some decent numbers. But great, easy to get to ground, right opposite the Etihad. It's not in the middle of nowhere. People are familiar with the campus. But it's still been hard work, and I think that's why it's really difficult, because there is not one size fits all model. And you are now balancing serving newer fans, serving hardcore old fans and their expectations, and what that looks like.
What do you think the progress of that is going to be in England? I think England is quite a particular place because it's a football mad country. A lot of other countries have a secondary sport that's quite close. I think football in England is very, very dominant. But again, the culture of women's football is still yet to be kind of exploded on an English football scene when it comes to media, when it comes to broadcast partnerships. So kind of that importance of that balance of community and club is down to having the right people in the right positions. I think Arsenal have been, they've historically been, they still have the only English Champions League trophy, Women's Champions League trophy in history. And the other clubs are struggling to keep up with that. So what do you think is kind of, outside of the obvious answer that the right people need to be in those positions, what do you think the future is right now to kind of progress that forward, especially when you look at the gap between, the Arsenals, Chelseas, Man Uniteds, Man Cities, to the Brightons, to the Leicester Cities? What do you think is the future for that progress?
Do you mean on pitch here?
Off the pitch, mainly.
Off the pitch.
Off the pitch, kind of, because obviously, off the pitch stuff transfers into on the pitch stuff. If you have the resources, the funding, the partnerships to make lives a lot easier, to make lives a bit more ambitious, I think, for the players as well. That's where it kind of, translates onto the pitch. But off the pitch stuff, the business side of clubs have been able to keep up with the top. What do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think the ironic thing is that Arsenal haven't really won much at all. Their last league title was 2019, last FA Cup 2016. Mm-hmm. That European crown was a very long time ago. Most Arsenal fans weren't even following the club then. So
a lot of them weren't even born yet.
Yeah, exactly, especially some of the younger people. So actually, that's the funny thing about women's football. The individuals and the national teams play such a huge part in creating those fandoms. I think we are moving now towards a place where clubs are getting better at trying to dial into some of their men's fans. I think Arsenal did that really well with making the women's team an exciting prospect for existing men's fans, for fans in the local area, as well as for families who kind of, I think, naturally go to games because they're just, they want a day out. They made it like
a one club mentality.
Yeah. And
everyone is the Arsenal. And
yes,
if you go to the men's, if you go to the women's, you're going to be looking at the same team.
Yeah. And I think that's been harder for other clubs to do, especially Chelsea. But I think they're getting better because, just anecdotally, I know a lot more Chelsea men's fans who are going to women's games, which is great. I think Chelsea have always had a really strong, hardcore base who would sell out Kingsmeadow and have done that for years.
Yeah.
But they're in very different areas. You've got a smaller stadium in the suburbs of southwest London, pretty difficult to get to, especially on a Sunday when there's engineering works, right? Yeah. And people who go to that are often people who live locally, and they'll go, they have season tickets. And there are still fans that are travelling much further who are Chelsea fans. But it's really blossomed out of having Kingsmeadow as this base. But then Stamford Bridge, that's a completely different prospect. It can be a completely different audience because it's a completely different bit of London. And that's where traditional Chelsea men's fans are used to going. So it's actually quite hard to feel like, okay, how am I hitting both of these? How am I navigating the price tag? And I think Chelsea have sometimes made things a little bit too expensive and learned their lessons in that sense. But it is a constant sort of journey and figuring out what's best, and it's not easy. But I also think in women's football and women's sport as well, I think, a lot of people are guilty of a bit of toxic positivity around things, of getting a little bit too lost in the sauce about where the women's game is right now, where you would look at Arsenal's Emirates games and think, oh my God, we've made it. Nothing is going to be the same again. Everyone must be billionaires on this. And the reality is, no, it's not true. Women's teams are still being subsidised by the men's clubs, and the broadcast revenue is increasing, and that will trickle down. But at this point, everyone is kind of on a marketing exercise to spend money to make money, and that's no bad thing. I mean, that's kind of how business works. Now, the exciting opportunity is that anyone who's going to be coming into this is coming in early, where there is a obviously much greater runway for growth. I think most of us who know the men's game know that things are plateauing a bit. When you look at media rights values, there are more games to purchase, but actually on a sort of financial sum, men's media rights aren't massively increasing like they were pre-pandemic when it was just like bam, bam, bam. So I think people see the women's game as an exciting opportunity because there's the first mover advantage, but there's also has to be a reality check that like I probably won't get a return on investment until maybe a little bit further down the line. But I think it's important to take an honest business approach rather than just sort of talk in unrealistic terms in this kind of what I think is toxic positivity about breaking records, blah, blah, blah. You know, that's all great. But then also you need to take a step back and look at the books and say, in reality, like, we are pumping money into this and we're not getting it back.
But we're still going to be a loss.
But we're still going to be a loss, but we're still going to be here. We're still going to stick around.
Yeah.
And we see the long-term vision. And it is a fine balance when you're talking about both. There isn't a right answer. It's not about just talking about how much money women's football is losing, because that's not helpful either. It's about having both and saying it's getting the numbers are going up, especially for broadcast rights, especially for sponsorship, and that's important. But it's also about making the ownership across the board that are putting money in feeling not frustrated by the fact that they think, hey, hang on, where am I going to recoup this? Because the reality is it might not be for a little bit.
Yeah, it was, I think Kelly Simmons on the podcast summed it up quite interesting. She's like, you're going to big brands, big clubs, big sponsorships, and having to convince them of a startup mentality. It's like you're going to these big guns with a lot of money and kind of being like, right, you know, you're going to invest in this and you're not going to get money back as if you're investing in, you know, say men's football. If Adidas is investing in men's football, for example, for the World Cup, you're not going to get nor the same revenue nor the same kind of feedback if you're doing that women's football, but you have to do it anyway. Someone has to do it, and there's been success stories. Leon, for example, started investing and has been at a loss for a lot of years, and look at them now. Was it 7 Champions League titles? And it is quite interesting to see that the business side of women's football and kind of the impact that it's had now, because I think now we're shifting to a lot of off the pitch stuff. You know, you have a lot of people working in women's football that, you know, care about it, have a lot of ambition. You know, people like us that have always been focused on the pitch stuff are now focused off the pitch stuff. So it is quite interesting to see the shift of business mindset of women's football, because now it's about progressing, commercializing, marketing, and having the stability in a lot of things. And it's interesting, especially, you know, I know you're familiar with all of European scale women's football. England is doing really well, and there's still a lot to be done. It's nowhere near the final phase, but England is probably the most progressive league, women's league in Europe when it comes to the balance and equality across the clubs, across, you know, the mentality shift of TV, of broadcasting. You know, you see Spain, world champions, Champions League, you know, winners, nowhere near as advanced and progressed as England. But yet again, you know, they have the success. You mentioned there, it was the success doesn't necessarily kind of say why and how the success of the league is in terms of commercializing a business side. But for you, kind of, now that you're a businesswoman, I'm going to call you that from now on, what has been the challenge for you coming into a women's football business that's now looking bigger and bigger, and you coming in with the fresh idea, a startup idea that's your own kind of project? What has been the biggest challenges that you faced starting that up?
That's a great question. I think the exciting thing is there are lots of people who are doing similar things in the space, so you can learn and get advice, and people are very generous with their advice and feedback, and that's what I'm so grateful for, because I've talked to so many different amazing people who are building their own spaces or building their own businesses in women's football. And, you know, when it comes to considering what direction you go in, some of them have made mistakes, made great steps, and they can kind of give you advice on there. I think the biggest challenge, and I'm still early on this challenge, is just getting those commercial partners, because if you are a startup like where I am with the Cutback, and you're saying the growth here is, you know, amazing in that we get at least 5 new subscribers signing up, putting in their email addresses, giving us them as a reader, as a member of the community every day. But our numbers compared to the general press, Guardian, Telegraph, Athletic, Times, it's not going to be the same right now. So it's about pitching it right to say, you as a sponsor, come on board, give us a little bit of money, and you can connect with a really engaged audience. The size of the audience might not be the same, but it's the engagement. And I think that's actually the same challenge for a lot of people in women's football and women's sport, is saying this is a hyper-engaged community. The community may not be as big as a men's sport community on sheer numbers alone, but they will pay attention. And I think there's tons of surveys and data about how much sponsors in women's sport and women's football, how they resonate with consumers. And like, honestly, there's about 5 surveys about those that sponsor women's sport or those that sponsor women's football. You know, they have a better brand reputation with customers. And I think that's really important, because it's sort of about just saying you may not reach as many customers, but you'll get a really good kind of consumer relationship on how you're viewed. You'll be viewed in a really positive way with consumers who will maybe likely spend money. But that's my next challenge, and it's one that I haven't secured yet. But obviously, you know, got Women's Euros on the horizon, and it's one that I really want to nail and say, you know, sponsor our coverage, come on board, ride the wave, and also get quite a lot of bang for your buck, because we're a small, very small, agile business. So actually, if you want to come and do quite a lot for your money, it's not going to be like if you went and sponsored one of the big media platforms who would command a pretty hefty fee. Yeah. You actually could get quite a lot and have quite a fun role to play and create something different and interesting, because it's you and a couple of people, myself and, you know, a writer or something, and we can create something. So yeah, that's the challenge, and I think a lot of people are navigating the same path as well.
Yeah, it's an exciting challenge. Basically, if you're watching this, invest in women's football.
Please do.
We need it. But I'll leave you at that. Hopefully, you know, come back to a year later, the Cutback has a commercial partner ahead of the Euros. I think it's I think we could stay here for a really, really long time to talk about this. There's a lot of things to navigate in women's football, a lot of places to kind of pinch in and progress its growth with the right people. But no, hopefully, good luck with the Cutback and Counterpress. You're a businesswoman now.
Thank you so much. Wow, I'm going to put that on my business card.
Flo Lloyd-Hughes, businesswoman.
Thank you.
But no, thank you for coming on, and yeah, we'll speak soon.
No, great to chat.